Unfortunately, after the Red River Rebellion, the Métis' problems were not over, and in 1885, the Northwest Resistance occurred. The Manitoba Act of 1870 set aside 500,000 of hectares for use by Métis people who live around the Red River settlement. However, the Canadian government was slow in distributing the promised land grants. Eventually, the Métis received title to land on which they had settled, up to 65 hectares each. They were also offered scrip. Scrip was a certificate or coupon entitling the holder to either cash or land. The majority of the Métis chose money scrip. More and more settlers were also coming to settle into Manitoba from the other provinces in Canada. Many military land grants were given in the area because the government wanted retired soldiers to settle there and be available as a militia. Also, many of the remaining buffalo were moving west. So several thousand Métis decided that the only answer was to sell their land grants and move west into the Northwest Territories. Many settled along the North and South Saskatchewan River, which flowed together east of Prince Albert. So the Saskatchewan River is here, and Prince Albert is right there. So they settled in here. So the Métis had moved and were now settling along the Saskatchewan rivers. They wanted to be away from the European settlers. And the Métis sent petitions to the government asking for new land right. However, these petitions were ignored. The Métis' way of living was also changing. They could not depend on hunting the bison for trade and food any longer. More Métis became farmers. However, during an economic recession, grain prices were low, so they didn't make much money when they sold their crops, and they had a very difficult time maintaining a living as a farmer. Settlers and Métis who settled around the town of Prince Albert expected the Canadian Pacific Railway to come through the town. The government, however, decided to move the CPR to the south. This meant the Métis and settlers had no way to trade goods with other parts of Canada. Instead, as you can see on this map, the Canadian Pacific Railway changed paths to go through Regina. The First Nations people who had been moved to reserves were also suffering greatly. They needed food, and the government had not given them the farm equipment promised to them in the Indian Act. Finally, the Métis also asked Louis Riel to come back to Canada. Riel told the Métis, European settlers, and First Nations in the Northwest that they had to protect their rights. Riel sent another petition to Ottawa. In it, he told the government about the concerns of the people. The petition started that they wanted their own provincial government. They also wanted to be represented in the federal government. MacDonald did respond. However, he only offered to give them land grants or cash for land. He ignored all other requests. The Métis were disappointed at MacDonald's response to their petition. They had expected more assistance. They asked Louis Riel to stay in Canada and help them, and he decided to stay. In March 1885, Riel and his Métis followers seized arms and ammunition from a store in Batoche and took several hostages. On March 19th, he set up a provisional or temporary government again, just like he'd done in Manitoba in 1869. Gabriel Dumont was appointed to be the military leader. The settlers and English-speaking Métis along the Saskatchewan River did not wish to join French Métis in an armed resistance. They were angry at the Canadian government, but most refused to follow Riel in violent resistance. Most First Nations also decided to not take up arms against the federal government. The two exceptions were bands led by Poundmaker and Big Bear. However, the First Nations acted independently of the Métis. In March of 1885, Riel and his followers started in Batoche, where they took ammunition and several hostages, and then the Northwest resistance began in Duck Lake on March 26, 1885, where Gabriel Dumont and a group of Métis attacked Superintendent Crozier of the Northwest Mounted Police and some of his men. The Northwest Mounted Police were on their way to remove guns and ammunition from a store at Duck Lake. 12 of Crozier's men were killed and 11 wounded after a half-an-hour battle, and 5 Métis were killed. At the end of March, Chief Poundmaker traveled to Battleford to meet with the government agent to discuss getting more food for his people. When the townspeople heard that Poundmaker was coming, they fled to safety at the fort. The town was deserted when he arrived, and the government agent refused to come out of the fort to talk with him. Poundmaker's companions became frustrated and angry. They broke windows and took supplies. The most serious incident of the armed uprising occurred on April 2nd at Frog Lake. Chief Big Bear's war chiefs, acting on their own, killed 9 people, including the government agent Thomas Quinn. Big Bear had wanted to negotiate. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald heard news of armed rebellion. He ordered 8,000 soldiers and volunteers to travel west on the unfinished Canadian Pacific Railway. The trip only took 9 days. Major General Frederick Middleton, the commander of the Canadian militia, was in charge of battle operations. He divided his troops into 3 groups. He and his column set out for the Métis headquarters at Batoche. A column led by Colonel William Dillon Otter set out for Battleford, where he hoped to find Chief Poundmaker. The 3rd column, led by Major General Strange, set out after Chief Big Bear and his men. Throughout the Northwest resistance of 1885, Riel was guided by his religious convictions because he thought he was sent by God to protect the Métis and get them their rights. Dumont wanted to use hit-and-run guerrilla tactics to defend Batoche. Riel insisted that he had been ordered by God through visions to wait until Batoche was attacked and then defend it. On April 24th, at Fish Creek, Gabriel Dumont's men attacked Middleton's column using the hit-and-run and then hit-again tactics that Dumont found so effective. Dumont was able to slow down Middleton's progress, but he did not stop him from reaching Batoche. Middleton arrived there on May 9th. The battle at Batoche lasted for 4 days, from May 9th to May 12th. 300 Métis and First Nations people had dug rifle pits from which they fired at their attackers. By the last day, the defenders were out of ammunition. They fired stones and nails from their rifles. Finally, Middleton's troops stormed the rifle pits and the battle was over. There were 25 dead from both sides. Both Riel and Dumont managed to escape. Riel gave himself up after a few days, but Dumont fled to the United States. Colonel Otter located Chief Poundmaker and about 200 followers at Cut Knife Hill, near Poundmaker's reserve. Otter had hoped to make a surprise attack, but the Cree were ready for them and drove them off. Poundmaker's men had every opportunity to kill Otter's soldiers, but Poundmaker held them back and allowed the soldiers to return to Battleford. He saw no honor in killing an enemy who had already been defeated. Poundmaker then decided to go to Batoche to help the Métis. On their way, they heard the news of the Métis defeat. Realizing that there was no point in further resistance, Poundmaker surrendered to Middleton on May 26th. On May 28th, Chief Big Bear and his men clashed with General Strange's soldiers at Frenchman's Butt. Strange withdrew at the end of the day, planning to fight again on the next. Big Bear and his men were low on ammunition. They took advantage of the lull in action to escape while they could. Both General Strange and General Middleton followed Chief Big Bear for the next few days. They never found him, but on July 2nd he surrendered accompanied only by his young son. His followers had either surrendered or gone elsewhere. Big Bear's surrender marked the end of the 99-day Northwest Resistance. The Northwest Resistance helped to only divide Canada. Louis Riel was put in trial in Regina for treason. He was found guilty by a jury of 6 Canadians. There were no members of the Métis, Roman Catholic, or French-speaking communities on the jury. The jury asked the judge for mercy, but the judge had no choice about the sentence. The automatic sentence for treason was execution. The French thought Louis Riel was a hero because he tried to protect the rights of his people. Many English considered him a traitor because he took up arms against the government. The French sent petitions to MacDonald and asked him to pardon Riel or put him in prison. However, the government still decided to hang him. You can see through this political cartoon there was quite a controversial decision on what Louis Riel's fate would be. The Northwest Rebellion also affected Canadians' attitudes towards First Nations people because the attitudes got a lot worse. Special passes were now needed for any First Nations person to leave the reserve for even one day. Although the Northwest Resistance also showed Canadians how quickly troops could travel to the west on the Canadian Pacific Railway to stop the rebellion. Because of this, more money was found to help finish the building of the railway. If another situation like the rebellion or a war with the United States ever occurred, troops could be sent away, and in 1898, the Yukon Territory was formed.